Okay, let's come back to section 171. In dealing with the issue of Jeremiah and Zechariah at the bottom of the Matthew account. Again, Matthew has already been tracing a number of the consequences of the unpardonable sin. And I think a better way to explain this is in that specific context. Again, he does quote Jeremiah at the end, but he begins with Zechariah, and this is the difficulty. Now, moving into the basic structure of Jerusalem in the Hebrew Bible, in the days of Jeremiah, this was also essentially Jerusalem. In the days of Yeshua, the third wall would not be built till AD 44. The third wall of Jerusalem was not as yet built in AD 30. The surrounding Jerusalem on the west and south side is the valley of Gay Hinnom. And on the east side is the valley of Kidron. Now, where the two valleys meet was a place called Tophet. And in Jeremiah's day, when King Manasseh was the king, the worst king the city had, he practiced human sacrifice. The human sacrifice was there in Tophet, where the two valleys meet. So in Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 31 through 33, Jeremiah 7, 31 to 33, and Jeremiah 19, verses 1 through 15, Jeremiah 19, verses 1 through 15, God, through Jeremiah, pronounced a curse on Tophet. They will come and they will bury and bury and bury in Tophet until there was simply no more room to bury. This was not fulfilled at the time of the Babylonian destruction, but it was fulfilled at the time of the Roman destruction in AD 70. And they buried and buried and buried in Tophet till there was no room to bury. Now, what the chief priest did with the 30 pieces of silver, since the donor was dead and they could not put it in the temple treasury, is to purchase a field for the common good, and they then named that section by an Aramaic name, Akal Dama, meaning the field of blood. And the point Matthew is trying to make is that when they purchased that field in Tophet, they also purchased the curse of Jeremiah. The day will come when they will bury and bury and bury in Tophet. Now, Akal Dama, there'll be no more room for burial. And the AD 70 judgment is the judgment upon them as a result of committing the unpardonable sin. So he starts out with Zechariah pointing out how much little they paid to purchase such a curse. He then proceeds to quote Jeremiah that the curse would now be hit that same area where they purchased the field. So I don't really see a discrepancy. The second one would be more, the first one I should say would be the more likely one, if this one isn't correct. And the second one would not be likely because that system about quoting one prophet for the whole scroll is only true when you quote the first prophet, and that would have been Isaiah. But I think in keeping what Matthew has already done with the consequences of the unpardonable sin, this would be a much better way to understand it. So now we come to the civil trial, the Roman trial, the Gentile trial. They also undergo 3 separate stages. I listed for you the 22 Jewish laws. Let me just give you 2 Roman laws that play a role in this trial. Number 1, all trials have to be public, and this one is going to be very public, much to Pilate's regret. But secondly, the beginning of the trial had to be with the prosecuting witness, accusing someone else of a crime punishable under Roman law. It is for this factor that they needed Judas, but Judas is now dead. So as there was initial stages of the Jewish trial, initial stages of the civil trial will also be disorganized and confused. Now the first stage is the first trial before Pilate. Pilate was a Roman citizen who was born in Spain. He was among the longest procurators ruling as a procurator. He was procurator from 26 till 36 AD, 26 to 36 AD. The trial takes place at the midpoint of his procuratorship. And though in Jewish writings he's known for his cruelty, he was normally a correct Roman, following Roman procedure. And although it is the very wee hours of the morning, notice Pilate is ready and dressed to conduct the trial. He was anticipating a trial because he had earlier released the Roman cohort for the purpose of having Yeshua arrested. It was supposed to begin with Roman law with the beginning of a prosecuting witness, which they no longer have. Now, John's account says they themselves entered not into the praetorium, that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. And people not understanding the Jewish system of this first century Israel assumed that Yeshua must have eaten his Passover a day early, because they hadn't eaten it here. But he was very, very careful to keep every key point of the Mosaic law. And the Mosaic law specified on what day of the first month the Passover was to be observed. But notice he's coming from Caiaphas. He represents the Sadducees. He represents the priesthood. And the priesthood would not partake with the priesthood, the ones only who partake of the Passover sacrifice. It was offered up at 9 o'clock a.m. and the first day of Passover, and later in the early afternoon, 25 men would partake of the Passover sacrifice. All the families partook of the Passover meal on the first night of Passover. But on the first day of Passover, the priesthood would partake of it, the one high priest and the 24 chief priests. This was also called the Chagiga offering. And that's what he's referring to. And so Yeshua did keep the normal Passover family observance, the first night of Passover, but who were dealing with the Passover sacrifice of the first day. And when keeping with the second Roman law, in John's account, end of verse 29, what accusation bring you against this man? His where Judas was supposed to step forward and provide the accusation, but he's now dead. So they try to do is simply pressure Pilate to pass the death verdict without any trial or accusation. So they respond in verse 30 of John, if this man were not an evildoer, we should not have delivered him unto you. They have no accusation. They have no witness. It's just an attempt to pressure Pilate to go ahead and, without trial, without accusation, without trial, just to pass the verdict. But Pilate, the correct Roman at this stage, will have none of it. So verse 31 he answers, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. If there is no accusation, there'll be no trial. If there is no trial, there'll be no condemnation. If there is no condemnation, there'll be no sentencing either. He's following the Roman procedure. Now the leaders respond, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death, meaning no longer lawful under Roman law. And the one window they could execute somebody didn't work, since they couldn't find two witnesses that showed a disrespect for the temple. And then John makes his editorial comment in verse 32 that the word of Yeshua might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what manner of death he should die. He's already prophesied several times he'll die by crucifixion. But keep in mind, crucifixion was not the Jewish mode of execution, that was the Roman mode. The Jewish mode of execution was to simply stone someone to death. By the way, it should be on page 18 at this stage. And we know from the Talmud, the time when the Roman Senate took away from the Jewish Sanhedrin the right of capital punishment, the date is it happened 40 years before the temple was destroyed. So the temple was destroyed in the year 70, subtract 40 years, they'll give you the year 30, which is the year of the crucifixion. So if this trial had taken only 6 months earlier, then he would have been stoned to death. But the proper time in God's providence, he had the Roman Senate take away from the Sanhedrin the right of capital punishment with that one exception. So now if Yeshua dies, he'll have to die a Roman death. And that will verify Yeshua's prophetic calling. So once they realize Pilate will not proceed with a trial, he has an accusation, they finally produce it. And that is in Luke's account, verse 2. Essentially, they're accusing Yeshua of 3 things. Number 1, he's perverting our nation, he's fomenting revolt. Secondly, he forbids giving tribute to Caesar, that would be an act of treason. And thirdly, he claims himself to be a king and therefore a competitor to Caesar. And that's a crime of sedition. Now that Pilate has a specific accusation, he could proceed with the trial. And so he now questions Yeshua with the question at the end of John verse 33, are you the king of the Jews? Now, from Pilate's perspective, he's not asking, are you the Jewish Messiah? That would not be the Roman issue. What he's asking is, are you really claiming to be a competitor to Caesar? To make sure the issue is clear, Yeshua responds with his own question in verse 34 of John, do you say this of yourself or did others tell it concerning me? In other words, on what basis are you asking me this question, from the viewpoint of a Roman or the viewpoint of a Jew? Pilate's response is, verse 35, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you unto me. What have you done? And Pilate answers, I'm asking you not as a Jew, that's not me. I'm asking as a Roman. Are you truly claiming to be a comparator to Caesar, which is what you're accused of by the chief priests? And again, these are the Sadducean members of the Sanhedrin. Now that the issue is clear, he can respond. And in John verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence and not from now. Simply put, no, I am not a comparator to Caesar, and that for 2 reasons. First of all, my kingdom is not of this world. And the last segment of the visible church holds to a view called amillennialism, meaning no millennium, no kingdom. And this is one of their support bases. Yeshua said that his kingdom is not of this world, and therefore they define it, there will not be a kingdom in this world. The kingdom is merely spiritual, not physical. But we already saw in John's account previously, he himself made a distinction between saying of the world and in the world. To be of the world is to be of this world's nature. And he was not of the world, and we who believe are not of the world. We are no longer of this world's nature. But as long as we are living, we are in the world. And he made that distinction. And so in his response, when he's saying, my kingdom is not of this world, it won't be of this world's nature, he's not merely coming to depose Caesar and sit upon Caesar's throne. He's coming with his own throne, the Davidic throne, and his own kingdom, the Messianic kingdom, and that kingdom will someday be in the world, but never of it. And secondly, its kingdom is not from hence, not from now. In light of the rejection, in light of the unpardonableness of that sin, the kingdom will not be established at this point of time anyway. And for these two reasons, he's not a competitor to Caesar. So Paul has a follow-up question at the end of verse 37 of John. Are you a king then? Are you a king in any sense of the term? And Yeshua responds, yes, I'm a king in one sense, I'm a king of the truth. And everyone that is of the truth does hear my voice. Paul then terminates the interrogation with the sarcastic question in John verse 38, what is truth? And what is so sad for Pilate is that this moment of time he was looking at the truth and failed to recognize him where he stood. And so when he comes back to the multitude, he declares, and this is his first declaration of innocency, in Luke verse 4, I find no fault in him. Or in John's account, I find no crime in him. At that point, in Mark verse 3, the chief priests begin to accuse him of many other things. And this time Yeshua does not respond. When Pilate tries to get him to answer in Mark verse 4, Yeshua still remains silent. Now, as these accusations are coming out, in Luke's account, verse 5, somebody mentions that he originates in the Galilee. And the mention of Yeshua's Galilean origins gives Pilate a way out of the situation. Because while both Samaria and Judea were under his jurisdiction, the Galilee was not under his jurisdiction. That was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, who would also come to Jerusalem at these festivals for the purpose of maintaining order. And so what Pilate chooses to do is wash his hands of it at this stage, symbolically now, more literally later, and simply sent him to the one in charge of Galilee, who happened to be in Jerusalem, Herod Antipas. The second stage, in section 173, is the trial before Antipas. This Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great. And this same Antipas is the one that had John the Baptist beheaded. And he early, after hearing of the miracles of Yeshua, he sometimes assumed that maybe this man is John resurrected from the dead. And he's, as we know from his account of his stepdaughter dancing, he likes to be entertained. And now what he wished is provided by Pilate. That's in verse 7, and in verse 8, Herod Antipas is now glad because he's assuming Yeshua can entertain him with those signs and wonders he had so much heard about, but Yeshua would not perform for him. Because miracles are never for the purpose of entertainment. That's a lesson some American TV evangelists need to learn. Miracles are not for the purpose of entertainment. So what he does reduce Yeshua to simple mockery. The second mockery he suffers before the cross. But in the end, Herod Antipas finds no crime that could be punishable under Roman law and simply sends him back to Pilate to make the final decision. Now, verse 12 says, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before there was enmity between themselves. The reason for the enmity is what happened when Pilate became procurator, And the Roman capital of the land was not Jerusalem, but Caesarea. So he brought the legions up from Caesarea to Jerusalem to exercise authority. And what he did is on the outside walls of the temple compound, he hung the Roman shields. And the problem for the Jewish people is these Roman shields had images of the gods and goddesses the Romans worshipped. And this was an issue and a problem of idolatry for the Jewish people. So this massive riot broke out in the city. He released his soldiers and many Jews got killed, but he still would not take the shields down. Now, Antipas was a nominal convert to Judaism, and he knew as long as those shields were up there, this would be fomenting more and more revolt. So he asked Pilate to take the shields down, and Pilate refused. So then Antipas wrote a letter of complaint to the Roman Senate, and the Senate ordered Pilate to take down the shields. Now he had no choice. So since then, the two were at enmity between themselves. But now at Messiah's expense, they become friends, because each one was now recognizing each other's authority in the district that was assigned to them. Now, 9 years later, in the year AD 39, his wife Herodias, who instigated the beheading of John, now got her husband to travel to Rome with her to ask for the title of King of Judah, the same title that had been given to his father Pilate by the Roman Senate, as Father Herod the Great, rather, by the Roman Senate. But the emperor at this point was Gaius Caligula, who was an insane madman. He left to spend the royal treasury on all kinds of royal parties and so on. And when the money was depleted, he was simply accused a wealthy landowner or a wealthy Roman of some crime against the state, have the whole family killed, and replenish the treasury for a while. He was so insane, he even made his own horse a member of the Roman Senate. And by the way, that horse always voted his way. And things got so bad that the Praetorian Guard, which was there to defend the emperor, they're the ones who assassinated him. But at this stage, when Pilate sent, when Antipas sent the Galilean, because Pilate sent the Galilean to Antipas, who was in charge of Galilee, there's now recognition of status in each parts of their territory. They became friends at Messiah's expense. But when the two asked for the title of king and queen from Caligula, he simply banished them. And when he banished them, they would die in abject poverty, and they paid the price for the beheading of John and the mocking of the Messiah. And so we come to the third stage of the civil trial, the second stage before Pilate. What Pilate will now do is to make several attempts to have Yeshua released. And the first attempt is issuing a third declaration of innocency. And this is in Luke's account, verse 14. First by him, second by Antipas. This is the third one, also by Pilate. But this does not alleviate the crowd. And by the way, the second declaration of innocency is found here in Luke's account, verse 15. So he then makes a second attempt to have Yeshua released, but falling back on a custom that had developed between the Roman authorities and the Jewish leaders. And this is in John verse 39, but you have a custom that I should release unto you one at Passover, And will ye therefore not release unto you the King of the Jews? And the reason he's making this offer is in Mark verse 10, he perceived that for envy the chief priests had delivered him up. And he knows that they're being motivated not by any crime that Yeshua was guilty of. What's happened with John? It was personal, but the charge will be political. Now, it's sometimes referred to Barabbas was a robber, but robbery was not punishable by crucifixion. Actually, he was guilty of the very crime Yeshua is accused of. Look at Mark verse 7. There was one called Barabbas, lying bound with them that had made insurrection. Men who in the insurrection had committed murder. So the actual charge is not merely robbery. Maybe he was a robber as well, but as far as facing the execution, the robbery would not be sufficient. As Mark points out, he was guilty of insurrection. Now, Barabbas is not a name. Barabbas is a Hellenized form of two Aramaic words, bar, meaning son of, and Abba. Most of the documents of the Gospels do not tell us his actual name, but there's certain documents which are behind the King James translation. Points out his name was also Yeshua. So here we have a man named Yeshua bar Abba, Yeshua son of the Father, which is what Abba means. In Aramaic, the Father. But he only has the title. And he really is guilty of insurrection against Rome. But the other Yeshua is the true son of the Father, is accused of leading sedition, but he's not guilty of sedition. And what Pilate is anticipating, they would ask for Yeshua of Nazareth, not Yeshua Barabbas. Now, while he's preparing to give them the choice, there's a small interruption from his wife in Matthew's account, verse 19, where she warns him about not getting too involved with this situation because of a dream she had. And this is long enough, the interruption is long enough for the events of verse 20 of Matthew. The chief priests, the Sadducees, and the elders, the Pharisees, begin to filter around the multitudes observing this trial. And when the final decision is made, they should cry out for the release of Barabbas and not Yeshua. And so this attempt to try to have Yeshua released also failed. But then came his third attempt to have Yeshua released, by offering a compromise of scourging. And you see this in John's account, chapter 19, verse 1. The Pilate therefore took Yeshua and scourged him. Now, when the gospel writers talk about scourging, they don't detail, because in the first century context, people knew what scourging entailed. Now we're 2,000 years later, and we don't always recognize the effect of the scourge. Now, there are two different kinds of scourging. There was a Jewish scourge and a Roman scourge. And the Jewish scourge was called 40 save 1. 40 save 1. And why 40 save 1? Because Mosaic law says no Jew could be whipped with over 40 lashes. And the school of Sophrim, when they tried to build this fence around the Torah, they raised the question, suppose the lasher is lashing, miscounts, and gives the victim 41 lashes and breaks the Torah. And so they decided to stop the count at 39, and it was known as 40 save 1, 40 minus 1. Now the Jewish scourge had a handle of wood or leather, short leather strands. The only part of the victim's body that was affected was the back, and while it was very painful, it was never deadly. And no one ever died of a Jewish scourge. But Yeshua does not suffer the Jewish scourge. By the way, Paul suffered the Jewish scourge 5 times and survived them all. It was never deadly. But the Roman scourge was far more severe. Also have a handle of wood or leather, but the strands were very long. At the end of which leather strand was a smaller nail, lamb bone, glass, or metal of some kind. And because of the length of the strands, they wrap around the whole body, affecting all sides of the body, but also the face. We got a lot of misconceptions about the crucifixion scene from paintings, which always shows the face of the Messiah intact, except for the crown of thorns. But after the Roman scourge, the face was very badly lacerated, as Isaiah predicted it would be in Isaiah chapter 52, verses 13 through 15. Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 15. And record shows that even family members after a Roman scourge could not recognize the victim anymore. So after a few lashes, the muscle, the skin would be torn apart, the small pieces of muscle would go flying. And many people never survived the Roman scourge. If that was not enough, the Roman soldiers get a piece of purple cloth to imitate a robe. And they would put this robe on him because they know he was accused of being a king and being a comparator to Caesar. This is in John's account, verse 5. And on top of his head, they put a crown of thorns. And if you look at the thorns in Israel, often they're very sharply pointed, razor sharp pointed. If you brush one against lightly, you could still bleed. When they put on his head after the scourge, which is what they did, it already caused pain, but since they kept hitting him, if that hitting also was hitting on the crown of thorns, the thorns would go deeper into the brow. It'll be that much more painful. And Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 7, Hebrews 12, 1 through 7 encourages that periodically we need to go over every detail of his physical sufferings, even the sufferings before the cross, as well as the cross itself. And once we understand how much he suffered, and in his case, he never committed any sin, he was sinless but still suffered as a sinner. Whatever we suffer will be quite mild in comparison to what he suffered. And assuming the scourging should be sufficient, he then brings Yeshua out, and now you have the 4th declaration of innocency. In John's account, verse 4. When they still cry out for the crucifixion, he makes his 4th attempt to have Yeshua released by merely refusing to pass the Roman sentence. In John's account, verse 6. Because from a human perspective, the final decision whether Yeshua lives or dies was Pilate's to make. And unless he passes the death sentence, Yeshua cannot die. What happens next in John's account, verse 7, is they drop the charge of sedition. It's not helping them any. And in verse 7, they bring out the real issue. We have a law, and by the law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. So the sedition issue is dropped. Now the real issue is his claim to be the Messianic Son of God. Now, this is a brand new accusation, so in John verse 8, Pilate tries to have a second interrogation, but this time Yeshua refuses to answer any of his questions. In John's account, verse 9. By this time, Pilate had received sufficient light to respond correctly. And so therefore, there'll be no more light given to him. And when Pilate tries to pressure him to answer, by pointing out this is in verse 10 of John, that he's got the authority to release him or to crucify him, Yeshua reminds him in verse 11, his power is purely delegated. Because the full power is from above, it comes from God, so he has only delegated authority. And furthermore, those who turn him over to Pilate will be guilty of the greater sin. Not all sins are equal. And Pilate still be guilty of sin, but the greater sin will fall upon the leaders. He then makes a fifth attempt to have Yeshua released in John's account, verse 12. Upon this, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews then started to cry out. But they had something else. Besides calling for crucifixion, they cry out. In verse 12, if you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. Because everyone makes himself a king, speaks against Caesar. Now notice how Pilate responds to these statements in verse 13 of John. When Pilate therefore heard these words, what words? If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. He takes his seat upon the judgment seat. And from the judgment seat, a verdict must be issued, and if the verdict is guilty, then a death sentence must be issued. Now the question is, why is he intimidated by this cry? If you release this man, you're not a friend of Caesar. Why would that intimidate him? And one possibility is because of something going on back in Rome. Now Pilate received his procuratorship through a friend named Sejanus, S-C-J-A-N-U-S, S-E-J-A-N-U-S. And the two men were friends, and when Sejanus became the captain of the Praetorian Guard, a very influential position, used that position to get Pilate the job of procurator. But then Sejanus decided he preferred to be emperor. He developed a conspiracy to assassinate the then Roman Emperor Tiberius. But the conspiracy was discovered, and Sejanus and other co-conspirators had been executed. And now the Senate was investigating everybody connected with Sejanus to make sure they're not part of the conspiracy, and that would include Pontius Pilate. Last thing he needs now is to work to get back to Rome to release someone who claimed to be a comparator to Caesar. And that's what intimidates him to take a seat from the judgment seat. But from that judgment seat, he makes a sixth attempt to have Yeshua released. And he brings him out and says at the end of verse 14 of John, "Behold your king." And when he asked them, "You want me to crucify your king?" And they answer, verse 15, "We have no king but Caesar." And they reject Yeshua as the king and accept Caesar as the king. But keep in mind, this is not the Pharisees saying it. The Pharisees would never say this. This is what the chief priests or Sadducees were saying, and they would acknowledge Caesar as the king. The Pharisees would not acknowledge this. At this point is when Pilate finally gives in. And so in Matthew's account, verse 24, he calls for a pitcher of water, assuming that merely washing his hands absolves him from any guilt, but it does not. Again, from a human perspective, the final decision whether Yeshua lives or dies was his alone to make. He knew what should be the right decision, but he made the wrong one. So merely washing his hand will not absolve him. And the early church did not absolve him. And when Peter in Acts 4 gives a message, and he mentions 4 key men who were directly responsible for Messiah's death, among the men was Pontius Pilate. And the earliest creed that we have in the church history is called the Apostles' Creed. One of the sentences in the Apostles' Creed says, he suffered under Pontius Pilate. Note that God forgave him. He was later banished by Rome. And in the end, he committed suicide. After washing his hands, notice at the end of Matthew verse 24, he makes his 5th declaration of innocency. He calls him of this righteous man. This righteous man. Again, a 5th declaration of innocency, but he does not act on what he himself has declared. And the next element, notice, is only reported by Matthew. Matthew continues to trace the consequences of the unpardonable sin. So in verse 25 of Matthew, and all the people answered and said, his blood be upon us and our children. But notice it's limited to them and their children. And when the AD 70 judgment came for the unpardonable sin, it came upon them and their children. It does not continue unto the 3rd and 4th generation. It is limited again to that generation. The judgment fell on that generation in AD 70. And what he does now is release Barabbas. And there's a symbolic substitution. The innocent one goes to die in place of the guilty one. And on Yeshua, he passes the death sentence. And he's turned over to be crucified. Now, section 175, the mockery. The whole cohort meets because they'll carry out the crucifixion procedure. And what Yeshua suffers here is, first of all, the 4th mockery before the cross, also the 5th physical mistreatment before the cross. Which brings us now to the 10th major division, the death of the king, goes from 176 to 181. And the procedure is from the time that with the procession heading for Calvary or Golgotha until the sealing of the tomb. There are 32 distinct stages. And the best way to handle the material is just to sequentially go through all 32 stages and making comments here and there. So I'm going to start a 32-point sermon right now. And we should be done by the time Passover, by the time the Sabbath meal begins at 5 o'clock. Actually, I won't finish it till after the Passover meal. Now, the first segment of section 176 is the procession to Calvary, or Golgotha, and this will cover the first 5 stages. Now, the first stage, in John's account, verse 17, they compelled the Messiah to carry his own cross to the crucifixion site. And in many paintings or pictures, they show Yeshua carrying the full cross. That's not the way, this was not the procedure. Now, the vertical shaft was already stationed in the ground where the crucifixion would occur. And the cross that the victim carries is the crossbeam, not the whole cross, but the crossbeam. It was typical Roman procedure to have the victim carry his own cross to the crucifixion site, but contrary to Jewish practice, to have a person scourged ahead of time. And because he suffered the Roman scourge, the body is weakened, you can only carry the cross so far. So it's the first stage. Messiah carries his cross. In the second stage, a man named Simon of Cyrene carries the cross the rest of the way. Cyrene is located in North Africa. So this was a Jew from North Africa that came to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. It is now the first day of Passover. The gates are open, and so there's now traffic going in, especially for many who want to observe the special Passover sacrifice. And apparently Simon was one of those that was suddenly forced to carry the cross. Now, because of so many pilgrims that would come to Jerusalem for this occasion, it was impossible to house everybody within the walls of the city. So unless you have special arrangements, as Yeshua had made, most of the pilgrims will observe the Passover living in tent cities outside the walls and partake of the Passover. And on Passover morning, many of them will go into the city to observe the Passover sacrifice. So again, this is what Simon appeared to be doing when he found himself compelled to carry the cross. In your homily, notice that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all mention a man named Simon or Shimon from Cyrene carried the cross, but only Mark mentions in verse 21 that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus, which means this is significant for the audience that Mark was writing, not significant for the audience that Matthew and Luke were writing. And we keep in mind that Mark was writing for the Romans. This will make it significant because when Paul writes the letter of Romans, he mentions the name of the same family. This is Romans chapter 16, verse 13, Romans 16, 13. You will know from Romans chapter 1, the Church of Rome was not founded by an apostle. It was founded by Jewish believers that migrated to Rome. And apparently that included the family of Simon of Cyrene, which shows that as he observed what was happening, he became a believer. His wife, mentioned in the Romans passage, also became a believer, as did these two sons. And so this event would have some long-term circumstances, results all the way to Rome. The third stage is Messiah's lament over Jerusalem. Luke is the only one that records this, and again, that's showing a special interest in the role of women. What we have in verses 27 to 31 is also a common practice of first century Israel, especially in Jerusalem, that when a Jew was taken out to be executed by Roman authorities, the professional wailers or lamenters would follow the procession with the loud lamentations you can still hear in certain kinds of Jewish funerals. These are not the women that came up to Jerusalem with him from the Galilee. He refers to them as daughters of Jerusalem. These are local women of the city of Jerusalem, following this common Jewish custom. But at some point, Yeshua stops the procession, turns around and says to them, "Don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." And this is in keeping with the curse they just took upon themselves with the Roman trial. His blood be upon us and our children, therefore weep for yourselves and for your children. Because while the 70 AD judgment will be very severe on the land in general, it will be especially severe on the city of Jerusalem. He then used a common saying, if they do these things, this is verse 31, if they do these things in the green tree, what shall be done in the dry? And the point of this saying is, if I suffer this much when I am innocent, how much more are you going to suffer that are guilty? Now the fourth stage is the arrival at Golgotha, which is Aramaic for the shape of the hill of the skull. Now, if you notice, none of the four Gospels say it looked like a skull. It was simply called the place of the skull because this was the official place where the vertical shafts were for the purpose of crucifying. Many of you have seen pictures that tourists come back from Israel. They show you a small cliff with these two holes embedded into them that gives it the appearance of a skull. That used to be a very noisy Arab bus station, so people would aim their camera in such a way that none of these buses would be showing because that would kind of spoil the feeling. And they've since moved the bus station about a block or two away, so they're no longer there at that cliff. And that was identified as the Protestant cavalry by a British general who was a very good general. However, he had no training in historical geography and less so of archaeology. And what tourists are not told is that those holes were dug out in the 1880s when they paved the road between the north wall and the cliff. On top of the cliff is an Arab Muslim cemetery. And again, it doesn't say it looks like a skull, only the place of the skull. There's similar thing here in a place called Dodge City, Kansas, where you have a hill called Boot Hill. It's not called Boot Hill because it's shaped like a gigantic boot. They call it Boot Hill because of what happened there. Gunfathers got killed and were buried with their boots on. And this was called the place of a skull, not because of what it looked like, but because this is where the crucifixions occurred. Now, between the Catholic site and the Jewish and the Catholic site and the actual site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is actually the more correct site. Not because it's Catholic, but because the tradition that is where he was crucified and that's nearby where he was buried goes back to the 2nd century. That's where Jewish believers used to have gathered together regularly because that's where he died and that's where he was buried. Only in the 4th century was the site converted into a Catholic shrine. But the origin of that view comes from Messianic sources, not Catholic sources. Now, the 5th stage is where he's offered a drink mixed with which is wine mixed with gall and myrrh. This was also a common custom to give to a victim before the crucifixion because it would help deaden some of the pain when the nails are nailed in. It was also a very stupefying drink that would make one lightheaded. So because he has to have full control of all that's going to happen on the cross for a spiritual conflict, he refuses to partake of this mixture. And what that means is that he will suffer the pain of the nail far more severely than others who have partaken of this mixed drink. Okay, we'll take our break and then we'll pick it up with the actual crucifixion.